Matthew 27, verse 1, we'll begin our reading. It says this: When the morning was come, all the chief priests and elders of the people took counsel against Jesus to put him to death. When they had bound him, they led him away and delivered him to Pontius Pilate, the governor. Then Judas, which had betrayed him, when he saw that he was condemned, repented himself and brought again the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and elders, saying, I have sinned in that I have betrayed the innocent blood. And they said, What is that to us? See thou to that. And he cast down the pieces of silver in the temple and departed and went and hanged himself. And the chief priests took the silver pieces and said, It is not lawful for us to put them into the treasury, because it is the price of blood. And they took counsel and bought with them the potter's field to bury strangers in. Wherefore that field was called the field of blood unto this day. Then was fulfilled that which was spoken by Jeremy the prophet, saying, And they took the 30 pieces of silver, the price of him that was valued, whom they of the children of Israel did value, and gave them for the potter's field, as the Lord appointed me. And Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor asked him, saying, Art thou the king of the Jews? And Jesus said unto him, Thou sayest. And when he was accused of the chief priests and elders, he answered nothing. Then said Pilate unto him, Hearest thou not how many things they witness against thee? And he answered to him, Never a word, insomuch that the governor marveled greatly. Now at the feast, the governor was wont to release unto the people a prisoner, whom they would. And they had then a notable prisoner called Barabbas. Therefore, when they were gathered together, Pilate said unto them, Whom will ye that I release unto you, Barabbas or Jesus, which is called Christ? For he knew that for envy they had delivered him. When he was sat down on the judgment seat, his wife sent unto him, saying, Have thou nothing to do with that just man, for I have suffered many things this day in a dream because of him. But the chief priests and elders persuaded the multitude that they should ask Barabbas and destroy Jesus. The governor answered and said unto them, Whether of the twain will ye that I release unto you? They said, Barabbas. Pilate said unto them, What shall I do then with Jesus, which is called Christ? They all say unto him, Let him be crucified. And the governor said, Why? What evil hath he done? But they cried out the more, saying, Let him be crucified. When Pilate saw that he could prevail nothing, but that rather a tumult was made, he took water and washed his hands before the multitude, saying, I am innocent of the blood of this just person. See ye to it. Then answered all the people and said, His blood be on us and on our children. Then released he Barabbas unto them, and when he had scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. And we'll stop there. We spoke last week from the previous chapter, and we talked about the trial by the Jews, the Jewish trial of Jesus. And it is necessary to sort of rehash a little bit of that to understand the setting for the Roman trial of Jesus that we just read. Now, this was intended to be one message, but there's no way we could ever have sat that long to go through the whole thing. So, it ends up being two. So these are very tied together. They're really the same theme. They really preach the same thing. The message to us is really going to be the same. But I think that we don't fully get it until we see the trial at the Roman court. Now, remember that at the time, the nation of Israel was conquered by the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire hadn't just conquered Israel, they had conquered pretty much everywhere. I mean, the known world was controlled by the Roman Empire. And so though the Jews had their own Jewish leaders, the highest court in the land was the Sanhedrin Council, they were not the ultimate authority in Israel at the time. The Romans were the ultimate authority. And the Caesar, of course, the head of the Romans. So we must understand that. Now remember that Jesus has not built a lot of goodwill with the Pharisees and the scribes and the priests, the leaders of Israel, the people who are on the Sanhedrin Council. And one of the reasons that they were chiefly angry at him was because the former high priest named Annas was, he was similar to today what we would think of when we think of the Godfather. He was the mob boss. He was the one who was behind what they call the bazaars of Annas, or the money changers in the temple that were involved in extortion and really forcing people, if they wanted to worship God, to end up paying exorbitant rates for temple-approved animals and to exchange their money for temple money. And so they were stealing from the people of God who wanted to worship God. And the person who was pocketing all the money, the criminal organization, was ultimately run by a guy named Annas. Now, Annas, because he had acquired so much power, was deposed by the Romans. The Romans didn't like the idea that Annas had so much power over the Jewish people and so much wealth, so they deposed him, even though the high priest was supposed to be the high priest until he died. And in his place, of course, Annas made sure that his son-in-law became the next high priest. Why? Because he had all the influence. He made sure to pull the right strings, to, the right people owed him the right favor to make sure that Annas, his son-in-law, become the next high priest. Well, Jesus is not only gathering crowds of people and teaching them, and they all believe he's the Messiah, but he's also telling people that the way the scribes and the Pharisees are teaching you is not good enough. Your righteousness must exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, or you're not going to heaven. He's literally telling them that the scribes and Pharisees have to repent, or they will perish just like every other sinner. And this is, of course, very offensive to the scribes and Pharisees. It causes a divide where the people have to choose either the scribes and the Pharisees and the priests or Jesus. And people are choosing Jesus, especially recently, because Jesus just raised a guy from the dead who had been dead for 4 days. And everybody knew he was dead. It wasn't just something one person said. There was a whole host of people there when he did it. It was all proven. And this is causing quite a stir. People are saying, Jesus is the Messiah, let's choose Jesus. And what does Jesus do? As soon as he walks into the city of Jerusalem, he goes right to the temple after Palm Sunday, after walking into the city and riding in on the back of a donkey. He goes right to the temple and he casts out the money changers, Annas' people, his guys, his henchmen, if you will. And he calls the temple a den of thieves. He says, you've made my house a den of thieves. You've literally made my house the mafia den, if you will. And this is what's taking place. Jesus cuts into the bottom line, casts out the money changers, and now the priests meet because they know they've got to do something about Jesus. They have to, because they're all beholden to Annas, and Annas is not happy. And so they've got to do something about him. And interestingly enough, Caiaphas, who's completely impartial here, the son-in-law of Annas, decides he's got to die. He's got to die. This is before a trial has even occurred. We talked last week about how every single part of a Jewish trial, every single safeguard to the Jewish justice system that ensured that they were more righteous, their verdicts were always specifically righteous and holy, mixed with grace and mercy to make sure that the person would never be put to death unless they were really guilty. I mean, they by the way, the Jewish justice system is the basis for our justice system today. And for most civilized countries, their justice system today is based on the system of justice that the Jews had, and no one else at their time had it. The Romans were known for their corruption. You just have to, as long as you don't make Caesar angry, you're fine. If you make him angry, you're not fine. There's no justice there. All the other court systems in the world at the time were known for being corrupt. But the Jews, their thing was they had a perfect, holy, pure justice system. And they threw it all out. They decided Jesus was going to die before they even had the trial. And then they went and arrested him and brought him to Annas. And Annas tries to figure out something that they can charge him with. And when Jesus won't give him something to charge him with, Annas gets frustrated and sends him on to Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin Council with no charges. And the Sanhedrin Council is put in the awkward position of having to prosecute a trial. They're the judges. They're not supposed to be the prosecution. They're not supposed to be coming and making finding charges. Not only are they trying to prosecute, but they don't even have any charges, and they are quite frustrated. So they concoct witnesses, but they can't get any of the witnesses to even agree about the things that they're doing. So they have to have two witnesses that agree, so that gets thrown out. They're doing it in the middle of the night, by the way, which is, of course, illegal in the Jewish justice system. And they're also doing it right before a feast day, which they can't do, because after they hear the witnesses, they have to take 3 days of fasting before they bring a verdict. Well, they're not doing that. They've got to kill him, and they've got to kill him ASAP. So they've gone through all of this. They've gone through this whole sham of a trial in the middle of the night, looking for witnesses. Finally, they asked Jesus himself, "Are you the Christ, the Messiah? And are you the Son of God?" Meaning, are you God in human flesh? Jesus says, yes. They say, good. All right, we'll put you to death for blasphemy, saying that you're God. Of course, Jesus can prove that he's God. He has proved that he's God. And he has witnesses to show that he raised people from the dead. He can prove everything. It's only blasphemous to say that you're God if you're not God, right? If you are, it's not blasphemy anymore, is it? In fact, in the Old Testament, God showed up in human flesh to Abraham in his tent. And that wasn't blasphemy for Moses to write that down in Genesis. Why? Because it was actually God, right? So what Jesus said is only blasphemy if he's not God. They didn't even try to attempt to prove that he's not God or to let him prove that he is God. Instead, they just said, great, blasphemy, we're gonna kill him. Now, that was what we covered last week. But we see here in Matthew 27, it says, verse 1, when the morning was come, the chief priests and elders of the people took counsel against Jesus to put him to death. This was overnight. This trial had taken place. But in the morning is when it has to officially take place. All the stuff overnight, everyone knows, doesn't count. So they've got to get together in the morning to make it appear official. So their morning starts at 6 o'clock. This is what we're talking about here. 6 a.m. in the morning on the day of crucifixion. Here is the council meeting together and saying, all right, verdict is death. They don't take any time to think it through. They don't give it a chance. It's done. Verdict is death. We're going to kill him. Let's put him to death. It says, when the morning was come, the chief priests and the elders made it official of the people, took counsel against Jesus to put him to death. And when they had bound him, they led him away and delivered him to Pontius Pilate, the governor. Now, there's a lot of history as to why they did this. Some people say, well, why didn't they just go ahead and kill Jesus right then and there? In the book of Acts, they got really angry and they stoned Stephen right then and right there. They just killed him. So why didn't they just kill Jesus? Well, here's the thing. The Sanhedrin Council could get away with killing somebody if he wasn't super notable and it didn't cause a big stir. But Jesus had turned all of the crowds to himself. And if they would kill Jesus right here, not only would they lose the support of all the people, but also they are in danger because all the people are for Jesus. They're in danger of being sent to the Romans because technically they're not supposed to be killing people. The right of execution was the Romans, according to Roman law. They would look the other way as long as the Sanhedrin didn't cause a big stink about it and the people didn't. But you're really not supposed to do it. And if the people are going to get upset, now you're going to be reported to the Romans. You're going to be in trouble. So they've got their goal here is that Pilate put Jesus to death. Pilate's got to be the one to do it. They can't be the ones to do it because it's got to look like this is Pilate's choice. However, they have really good reason to think they can get Pilate to do it. Now, what we know from history is that when Pilate became the governor of Israel, of the region of Judea, it was problem after problem after problem for Pilate. Now, remember, the governors here that are put over these different provinces in the Roman Empire, their job, they have one job. It's just one simple job. Keep them peaceful. Make sure they don't revolt. Keep them peaceful. Do it by force. Do it by kindness. Don't care. Just keep them peaceful. You have one job, Pilate, is to keep them peaceful. Well, Pilate thought, he could keep the Jews peaceful by force. So when Pilate first became the governor, several years before this, he marched into Jerusalem with this big, pomp and circumstance, show of force, and he had an insignia on his banners and stuff with an image of Caesar. And this, the Jews said, Caesar calls himself a god. You have a picture of God, of someone you call a god, on a flag or on a banner in the holy city. You are bringing idolatry into Jerusalem. They rioted. They were very upset. And Pilate, of course, being the man who's showing strength and trying to keep them all under his thumb, he refused to take those banners down, the insignia. He wouldn't do it. In fact, he ended up leaving Jerusalem and going to his home base, Caesarea, and the Jews followed him, rioting all along the way, and for 5 days they laid outside of his palace in Caesarea, protesting, until finally he came out and he, again, this show of force, he said, listen, I'm going to kill every single last one of you if you don't go home right now. And they all said, they bared their necks and said, go ahead. They called his bluff. Now Pilate can't actually kill them because that's going to get back to Caesar, and Pilate's going to be in trouble. And also, it's probably going to start an uprising among the Jewish people if he slaughtered a bunch of Jews who are just saying, hey, our necks are bare, go ahead and kill us. So they called Pilate's bluff. Pilate had to back down and take down the banner. Pilate's now ashamed and embarrassed, and the Jews are 1-0, right? That's how it works. 1 is the victory, right? 0 is the loss. A little bit later, Pilate decides he's going to upgrade the water system in Jerusalem, and so he wants to build this aqueduct and all this kind of stuff. He chooses to do so by taking the money for the project out of the temple treasury. Well, the Jews are not happy about this. This was money that was given to God, and now the Romans are using it for this aqueduct project that they want to do. The Jews riot about it, the people in Jerusalem, and Pilate says, no, not this time. He sends people in with clubs and with spears, and he beats and slaughters the Jews, and he puts himself in some really hot water. The Jews do not like him. It looks like there's about to be a revolt. Now there's all these zealots around who want to overthrow the Romans, and Pilate's reporting to Caesar is not looking good. He's in trouble. Well, then a third thing happened. Pilate decided that he was going to, on the guards that guarded his palace, they had on their shields the name of Caesar, just the name of Tiberius Caesar on their shields as he guarded his palace in Jerusalem. Again, Jerusalem, the holy city, the name of a false god is written on these shields. They get upset, they get angry. And this time Pilate says, nope, I'm not going to do it. I will not back down on these shields. And so the Jewish leaders write a letter to Caesar, to Tiberius Caesar, whose name is on the shields, like whose name the shields are honoring. They write a letter to him complaining about it, and he writes a letter back to Pilate saying, take down those shields. What are you trying to do? Start a riot. Now, Pilate knows he's this close to losing his job, probably losing his head, if he can't keep Israel, the Jewish people, from rioting and revolting again. And the Jews know they have him right where they want him. The Jewish leaders now, the Sanhedrin Council, are sending Jesus to Pilate, knowing that if Pilate says no, all they have to do is pretend to start a riot. And Pilate has to back down. He has to, because they've got him right where they want him. And so with all of that as the background, let's read the trial. Interestingly enough, Matthew includes for us not only the outrageous travesty of justice that is the trial, the Jewish trial, but he, in verse 3 through 10, he includes the fact that even Judas, the betrayer of Christ himself, recognized what a travesty of justice that had just taken place and returned the money feeling so overcome with guilt, knowing even though he wasn't a believer in Jesus for sure, he still was so sure that Jesus was innocent of these charges that he returned the money and went out and hanged himself. He was overcome with guilt. Matthew's trying to make sure that we understand that every part of this story tells us that Jesus was innocent, that he was not guilty, he was not worthy of death. Verse 11 is where we'll pick up. Jesus stood before the governor. Now, we can compare this to some of the other Gospels. In the book of Luke, chapter 23, and John 18, you see Jesus standing before Pilate. And what happens here in this part, we get a little bit more detail of the other Gospels, but the Sanhedrin council brings Jesus to Pilate, and then Pilate goes into the judgment hall. Jesus goes into the judgment hall where Pilate is sitting. But the Jewish leaders, the Sanhedrin, the council, they have to stay outside. Now, they don't have to stay outside. They choose to stay outside. And they do so because the Pharisees had a rule. Now, that's not a surprise, right? The Pharisees had a lot of rules. And one of their rules was that if you go into a Gentile's house, you become unclean. Well, in the Old Testament, there was a law that said if you touched a dead body, you would be unclean until the evening. You'd have to wash yourself, and you weren't supposed to be doing things with other people because you could pass on some disease, whatever killed that dead body, right? And so the Pharisees had taken that and they ran with it. They said, well, you know what? The Gentiles are kind of like dead bodies. I mean, they're pretty awful. And, who knows what they've touched and what things they've done in their unholy state. And so if I touch a Gentile, I am definitely unclean. It's just like touching a dead body. And not only that, if touching a Gentile makes you unclean, then going into a Gentile's house has to definitely make you unclean. Imagine all the uncleanness that's just dropping off of the walls of their house. So this is a feast day. If they were to go into the house of Pilate, to the hall of Pilate, now they're going to be called unclean and not be able to take part in the feast. So just by the Pharisee standards, not by the actual law of God. But anyway, so they're not going inside. So they stay on the outside. Pilate then takes Jesus. And the first thing that we find out, in the book of John is that he goes and he says, guys, why did you bring him here? Like, what are your charges? And the Sanhedrin say to him, they respond, they say, if he weren't a criminal, we wouldn't have brought him to you. Go ahead and kill him. No, I need a charge. So in Luke, we read that they finally give him the charge. The charge is, well, he claims to be a king. Now, remember what they had convicted him for in the Jewish court. It was that he had blasphemed. He called himself God, which wasn't blasphemy, again, if you are God, but he called himself God. But Romans don't care about that. The Romans are going to put someone to death because he called himself God. But maybe the Romans will put him to death because he called himself king. So they're going to claim that he called himself king. Now, has Jesus called himself king? No. I mean, he's called himself the Messiah. And of course, the Messiah is going to reign as the king one day. But he hasn't called himself king. And so now Pilate goes and has to go and ask Jesus, well, are you king? This is what we read in Matthew 27. Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor asked him, saying, art thou the king of the Jews? And Jesus answered unto him, thou sayest. Now we also know in John that he gives a little more information. He explains, my kingdom is not of this world, otherwise my servants would fight. Like right now, yes, I'm a king, but right now the kingdom isn't in this world. So that's what's going on here. And of course, we know Jesus is returning one day to set up his kingdom in this world. He was there the first time for the purpose of dying for our sins, which is why he's not going to give a defense. He's not going to try to get out of this. He's there to die because you and I deserve to die, and he's got to die in our place. And so there's not going to be any charges that can stick to him. So if he defended himself, he would win, right? So he has to not defend himself. That's the whole point. Verse 12, when he was accused of the chief priests and the elders, he answered nothing. Then said Pilate unto him, hearest thou not how many things they witness against thee? And he answered never a word, insomuch that the governor marveled greatly. Now, in Luke 23, if just for your own study, you can check, and it's at this point that the people say, the Sanhedrin claim that he's been saying these things all the way in Galilee, where he's from, all the way to now. And Pilate gets an idea. Pilate, according to John, well, turn with me, if you would, to John chapter 18. This is a kind of an important statement that he makes after the first interrogation with Jesus. John chapter 18, verse 38. Jesus explains, my kingdom is not of this world, all of that. Verse 38, Pilate said unto him, that is to Jesus, what is truth? Like, I'm not really so concerned with this, what you say is true. I'm just wanting to see if there's anything that you've actually done that's, that's worthy of death. And he said, when he said this, he went out again unto the Jews and said unto them, I find no fault at all. Now, this is a verdict, right? We even today in our court system, when we find a verdict, the jury will read, hey, we find the defendant not guilty. That's exactly what Pilate has done. He's interrogated him. He comes back out to the Jewish Sanhedrin and he says, I find no fault at all. I'm going to let him go. And they keep on accusing him. So he finds out that in their accusations that he's been in Galilee, that he's from Galilee, and he knows that Herod, who's the governor over Galilee, happens to be here in Jerusalem for the feast. So he's like, great. Here's a great opportunity for me to not have to put this innocent guy to death. He sends him off to Herod. Now, you can read about that in the book of Luke, chapter 23. Herod basically laughs at him, says this guy's a joke, and sends him back. Now, remember, at this time, Jesus is bound. He was beaten all night. He was up all night being beaten and spit upon. Probably that's when they plucked his beard. So he doesn't look grand and prophetic, which is what Herod wanted. He wanted some grand kingly prophet who's going to do some miracle for him. And so Herod kind of laughs at him and sends him back. And now he's back before Pilate. Now this has been all morning, right? At 6 o'clock, the Sanhedrin met to make it official and then send him off to Pilate. He goes to Pilate. Pilate interrogates him, sends him to Herod. Herod interrogates him, laughs at him, sends him back to Pilate. Now we're probably 10 or 11 o'clock. We're probably in that range in the morning. It's going to be about noon when he's sent to the cross. And here we go. We'll pick up the story in verse 15 of Matthew 27. Now at the feast, the governor was wont to release unto the people a prisoner whom they would. And they had a notable prisoner called Barabbas. Now, Pilate has another idea. Here's my last attempt, right? First he said, I find no fault, didn't work. Then he sends him off to Herod, didn't work. Here's my last attempt. My last attempt at this is I'm going to offer them a release of prisoner, which he normally did at the feast day. But I'm going to give them, he's crafted this whole, maybe he even knew that he was going to come back from Herod, and he had been planning and crafting this, I don't know. But he'd crafted this whole option that really, made him look pretty smart, actually. So the idea was that he was going to offer them either Barabbas or Jesus. Notice that in verse 17 it says, when therefore they were gathered together. Now it's not just the Sanhedrin council that's outside the door, there in the street or in the courtyard outside of Pilate's door. It is, he gathers all the people together. Now, remember, at 6 a.m., the Sanhedrin council had tried to give it to Pilate, get Pilate to kill him before anybody ever knows about it. It doesn't work out so well because Pilate keeps delaying. So now people are waking up. People are hearing about what's going on. They're out in the street. And now Pilate has people here besides just the Sanhedrin. And so he's going to try to pit the Sanhedrin against the people. He knows that Jesus, just a few days ago, just 5 days ago, rode into Jerusalem on a donkey. Everybody was cheering for him. They all loved him. And so he's like, here's what we do. We're going to pit the people against the Pharisees. Now, what probably is the case, we know that Barabbas was arrested and that he was a thief, and that he had committed insurrection, and in the insurrection, he had also committed murder. He had killed somebody in this insurrection. Now, chances are, we don't know this for sure, but I'm just guessing here. This is stepping out on a whim, but I'm pretty sure that what it says when it means that what it means when it says that he was an insurrectionist, he committed insurrection against the Jewish leaders, the Jewish government, not the Romans. Right? If he committed insurrection against the Romans, then offering that, obviously everybody would choose Barabbas. Yeah, get him out. We like him, But rather, it seems like he was actually a murderer of another Jewish person, and he was part of an insurrection against the Jews. So why would they choose that guy? They want him to die, right? And then he says, or I'll give you Jesus. And then he adds this name, which is called the Christ. Now, remember, the word Christ means Messiah. He's like, or I'll give you your Messiah. You guys pick. Do you want your Messiah, or do you want Barabbas, who's the opposite of your Messiah, fighting against you guys and is about to be put to death for it? Seems like a good idea, but there's a problem. God wants Jesus on the cross. It's part of the plan. For your sake, for my sake, for the sake of all of humanity. And so, notice this interruption. Pilate sets up this question. It's a brilliantly crafted question. And then there's an interruption. Look what it says. When he was sat down in the judgment seat. So it appears that they maybe even brought his judgment seat out maybe to his balcony where he could sit in his judgment seat and have them cry which one they wanted. When he sat down in his judgment seat, his wife said unto him, saying, have thou nothing to do with that just man, for I have suffered many things this day in a dream because of him. So he gets a messenger, and he has to step away for a minute to hear the message from his wife, which says, don't have anything to do with that guy. He's just, maybe she's heard about him, maybe she's heard some of his teaching, whatever, but she suffered in a dream that night. She had a nightmare about him and said, don't have anything to do with it. This interruption gives the Pharisees time to go to all the people and convince them they want Barabbas. Look what it says next. But the chief priests and elders persuaded the multitude that they should ask Barabbas and destroy Jesus. So while Pilate is distracted for just a moment, turning to hear the messenger from his wife, the priests are going to all the people and saying, you really want Jesus? If the Romans want you to have Jesus, do you really think he's the Messiah? If the Romans call him the Christ, do you really want that Christ? You sure you want Jesus? We found him guilty of blasphemy. Do you really want to side with the Romans on this versus the Jewish leaders? And they managed to rile up the whole crowd and convince them to yell, Barabbas. Then the governor turns back. Pilate comes back, verse 21. The governor answered and said, whether of the twain will ye that I release unto you? They said, Barabbas. And you can see Pilate's jaw drop. The scribes and the Pharisees and the Jewish leaders have just beaten him for the fourth time. He's 0-4 against the Jewish leaders. They've beat him again. They say Barabbas. Pilate says, what shall I do then with Jesus, which is called the Christ? He emphasizes that name. What am I going to do with Jesus, the Messiah, your Messiah? And it says that he knew that they had delivered him for envy. He knew what was going on. Pilate understood that the Jewish leaders were envious of the popularity of Jesus. They didn't like the idea that Jesus wasn't going along with them. He wasn't supporting them. He was teaching something different. And he knew what was going on here. And he was going to be doing the Pharisees' bidding. He was going to be doing the bidding of the priests who were always against him. He wasn't on their side. Now, think about it from this perspective. If Pilate could have found one thing that he could have put Jesus to death for, don't you think he would have? I mean, that would have solved his problem. If he could only have found something Jesus really had done, that he really deserved death for, man, that would have fixed this whole thing. But he couldn't. The greatest power of the Jewish nation, searching all over for witnesses, could not find two witnesses to agree against Jesus to put him to death. And Pilate, though he had all the pressure and all the reason in the world to put him to death, would not put him to death because he's like, man, there's nothing I can find, absolutely nothing. Give me something, please. There is no doubt that Matthew is writing this so that his audience who reads this understands that Jesus was an innocent man. But look at the next few verses, because this is where it becomes very damning, I would say. Verse 23, and the governor said, "Why, what evil hath he done?" But they cried out the more, saying, "Let him be crucified." When Pilate saw that he could prevail nothing, but rather a tumult was made, he took water and washed his hands before the multitude, saying, "I am innocent of the blood of this just person." Why did Pilate wash his hands? What was the meaning for that? Well, he was participating in a Jewish practice. He was showing the Jews something by participating in a Jewish practice. Look with me, if you would, at Deuteronomy chapter 21. Deuteronomy 21. Verses 7 and 8. This is part of the law that's giving the Jews the requirements for if they find a dead body in a field. They're to find a human being dead in a field. They are to do everything they can to investigate and see if they can find who killed that person. It is their job. God is going to require at their hands that they find the person who did this and bring them to justice. It is their job. And if they cannot find the person who did this after doing everything they can, then they are to wash their hands so that the blood of that innocent person doesn't rest upon them. God does require the blood of innocent people at the hands of a town or a government. God does require that. If someone is murdered, God requires that of that government. Look what it says here in verse 7. And they shall say, this is if they cannot find the murderer, they shall answer and say, "Our hands have not shed this blood, neither have our eyes seen it. Be merciful, O Lord, unto thy people Israel, whom thou hast redeemed, and lay not innocent blood unto thy people Israel's charge, and the blood shall be forgiven them." So they say, we've done everything we can to find the person. We've done everything we can. Now we're washing our hands to say that we are not responsible for not having found and brought this person to justice. Now, this is a beautiful justice system, by the way. This is perfect. That's what God created. But here is Pilate washing his hands, saying, "Listen, I am not responsible for this travesty of justice, for the innocent blood that you are about to spill. I'm washing my hands of it." Now, look, if you will, with me at Matthew chapter 23. Matthew 23, just a few chapters earlier. A lot has happened since this. This was after Jesus, after his triumphal entry on Palm Sunday, after casting out the money changers. The priests and the scribes and the Pharisees come out and try to challenge him, to try to trip him up in his words, and they are devastatingly ineffective. They actually made themselves look far worse than Jesus. And then Jesus, in Matthew 23, gives an entire teaching about the Pharisees. He says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites!" And he goes on and on about their failure as leaders of the Jewish people who are rejecting. They're failing because they're rejecting the Messiah when he shows up, which is what the Jewish people were all about. They were supposed to be waiting for the Messiah. Now, in Matthew 23, at the end of this condemnation of the Pharisees who have now rejected him, he says something. Now, before I read that, I want to read you, you can keep your fingers there. I want to read you the last verse, the last two verses of the book of Malachi. Remember, the Old Testament ends with the book of Malachi, and the New Testament starts with the book of Matthew. In the Old Testament, the prophets are prophesying about how the Messiah is going to come. He's going to come in the future. He's going to come in the future. Matthew, we start reading about how the Messiah comes, right? So in Malachi, the very book before that, the end of the Old Testament, here's how the Old Testament ends. "Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord." Now, we know in both comings of the Lord, there's an Elijah the prophet that comes. But in this coming, right, when Jesus comes, it was John the Baptist who is in that position. He was the one warning everybody, hey, the Messiah is coming. Hey, the Messiah is coming. Look, it says, verse 6. He shall turn the heart of the fathers to the children, and the heart of the children to their fathers, lest I come and smite the earth with a curse. The Old Testament ends with this promise that when the prophet comes and announces the Messiah, you better listen to him, and you better accept the Messiah when he comes. You better be ready, because if not, I'm going to smite the whole earth with a curse because you rejected the Messiah. Now, after Jesus enters into Jerusalem and is rejected by the Jewish leaders, he then, in Matthew 23, pronounces that curse. Look what it says, verse 37. Actually, let's back up to 34. We'll just keep going backwards, right? Verse 34. Wherefore, behold, I send unto you prophets and wise men and scribes, and some of them ye shall kill and crucify, and some of them ye shall scourge in your synagogue and persecute them from city to city. Notice the wording here, that upon you may come all the righteous blood shed upon the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel, all the way back in Genesis, unto the blood of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, whom ye slew between the temple and the altar. That's another story from the Old Testament, an innocent person that was killed. Verily I say unto you, all these things shall come upon this generation. He's telling them, because you have rejected the Messiah, you're here to be the people who accept the Messiah. I'm here as the Messiah. You've rejected me. So the blood of all of the innocent people that have ever been killed in Israel are going to be dripping from your hands, and I'm going to require it from you. And he says, verse 37, O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, thou that killest the prophets and stonest them which are sent unto thee, how often would I have gathered thy children together, even as a hen gathereth her chickens under her wings, and ye would not. Behold, your house is left unto you desolate. For I say unto you, ye shall not see me henceforth, till ye shall say, Blessed is he that cometh in the name of the Lord. And Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came to show him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said unto them, See ye not all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. 37 years after this moment, this prophecy came true. Within a generation of time, the scribes and the Pharisees, Annas and Caiaphas, were probably still alive. Now, we don't know, but we don't know exactly how Annas and Caiaphas died. But these Sanhedrin members are probably still alive 37 years later. And it's at that moment when the Roman Emperor Titus comes and he destroys the city of Jerusalem. He destroys all of the nation of Israel. And for the next nearly 2,000 years, there will not be a nation of Israel. They will not have a land for almost 2,000 years. It was 1948 when they finally came back into their land and set up a nation again. Until then, from 70 AD all the way until 1948, no Israel. I mean, there were the people of Israel, but there was no nation. Why? Because Jesus had said they forsook the Messiah, and on them was going to come the curse promised by Malachi. And now look at what they're saying here in verse 24. Pilate says, he washes his hands, saying, I am innocent of the blood of this just person. See ye to it. Then answered all the people and said, His blood be on us and on our children. Know this, that Matthew is writing this gospel probably only a few years before 70 AD. He's writing to remind them that this is coming, it's coming soon, and they accepted the penalty. They said, His blood be on us. They rejected all semblance of justice out of rage to kill Jesus, and they accepted the penalty on themselves and said, His blood be on us. And Matthew's writing this to an audience of Jewish people who are only a few years from seeing this terrible destruction. And he wants them to know, when you see it, know Jesus said this was going to come because the Jewish people rejected and forsook and betrayed and put Christ on the cross. We have really three different ways in these two chapters, Matthew 26 and Matthew 27, that people responded to Jesus. We have Judas, who responded to Jesus by saying, well, I think I can make some money out of that. And his end was he died. He would not submit to Christ as Lord. And when he realized that he had betrayed an innocent man, though he'd never submitted to him as Lord, he was so overcome with guilt at being part of killing this innocent man that he went and killed himself. Then we have Pilate. Pilate seemed to also be overcome with guilt. It's only a few years later when Pilate is going to have another showdown with the Jews, and he's going to fail, and he's going to be retired from his position. He's going to be fired. And once Pilate is fired, he returns to Gaul and there kills himself. Also overcome with guilt, much like Judas. Then you've got the Jewish people, the Sanhedrin Council, who they saw Jesus because he demanded their submission to him as Lord. They saw Jesus as a problem, and they had to kill him. And what happened to them? 37 years later, they were wiped out. And all of the other Jews who didn't really understand the whole scenario and everything that was going on, but they were all ready to cry, Barabbas, crucify him. Crucify Jesus, give us Barabbas. And they were also wiped out in 70 A.D. The picture is very clear. We have two choices. Every single person has two choices. It's not, well, I think Jesus is kind of a nice guy, and I think he was a good guy, and I think he taught some good things, and I think you can learn some good things from Jesus' teaching. That's not an option. You have two choices. Jesus is Lord, or you will bow before him too late and find that he truly is the Lord that you denied. Either you say right now, Jesus is Lord, I will submit to him. Or one day when it's too late, you'll say, Jesus is Lord. I wish I had submitted to him. This is the only two choices presented to every human being on the planet. What will we do with Jesus? Father in heaven, you sent the perfect Lamb. They interrogated him, they investigated, they examined every single way they could, and they could find no blemish in him. But yet they could not bear the thought of submitting to him. And so they killed him. God, help us. Help us to submit to Jesus Christ. Lord, for those who may be hearing this message today or some other day, online, recorded, who have never chosen Christ as their Lord, I pray that today they would make that choice before it's too late. They would turn to Jesus as Lord. For us who are Christians who say, yes, Jesus is our Lord, help us to see the reality of his lordship, his perfection, his holiness, his love in dying for our sins. He kept his mouth shut because he knew that on him would need to be laid all of the sins of the world. Lord, help us to ever bring our lives more and more into submission to the Lord Jesus Christ because of his love, because of all that he's done for us. We pray these things in Jesus' name.